My name is Chanel Hayson. I am the Director of Outreach and Community Relations for the Elakha Alliance, and we're so thrilled to have you join us this evening for a really fantastic presentation entitled Chasing Kelp, a bull kelp journey along the Pacific coast with Josie Iselin. So I am just going to do a little summary about the Elakha Alliance and some fun facts about us and updates before I pass it over to Josie. So sea otters were very much plentiful along the entire west coast from Mexico to Alaska, but now there's currently a 900-mile gap from Northern California to Northern Washington where sea otters are nowhere to be found. And that's mostly due to the fur trade in the late 1900s, where the last sea otter was last seen in about 1906. Here on your screen, is a lone male sea otter that has been seen over the last couple weeks off the coast of Newport, and he is quite popular. A lot of people have come from all across the state to see him out in the water, which is really exciting. But unfortunately, here's an update of him today. He washed ashore yesterday at Cobble Beach with some injuries. So he was taken to the Oregon Coast Aquarium and he was treated for lacerations and puncture wounds, most likely due to a shark bite. But he survived anesthesia and surgery. So that's positive. He's eating and in recovery. They have limited human interaction with him. So we are hoping that he recovers fully so he can be released back out into the wild. So we'll be posting updates as we get them from the aquarium, so stay tuned. Hopefully he is okay. So there is a super strong cultural heritage connection in Oregon with sea otters and the coastal tribes. The Elakha Alliance came into place by an idea from Dave Hatch, who is a Siletz tribal member of the Siuslaw and Aleut descent. He recently passed away several years ago, but his passion project is very much alive. He was searching for an indigenous name for a sailing boat that he was building with his son, Peter Hatch, who's actually our secretary on our board. And they came up with the name Elakha from a Chinook dictionary, which is the word for sea otter. And as you can see here, there's 6 different terms for sea otter along the Oregon coast from different indigenous tribes. So they were very much plentiful. And so anyhow, back to the story. This led him to question, well, if there's a word for sea otter, where are they? Why don't we see any on the Oregon coast? And so he gathered people to raise awareness and try and figure out where the sea otters were, why they weren't here, and possibly can we bring them back and reintroduce them. So that led to the Elakha Alliance coming into place. Our mission is to restore a healthy population of sea otters here on the Oregon coast once again, and in the process help make our marine ecosystems more robust and resilient. Since they are keystone species, they are really crucial with their impact within the ecosystem to make sure everything's healthy. We do have a feasibility study draft. So that's basically looking at all the different factors for reintroducing this species back again on our coastline. We just ended yesterday, November 30th, our feedback form. So we are taking the feedback that people have written to us over the last several months and creating a final draft to be published at the end of January. So be on the lookout for that. So some utterly exciting updates on our end. We have our final webinar of the year will be on Thursday, December 16th. It's a holiday otter wrap-up party. Myself and Bob Bailey, the board president, will be on our holiday finest, and we will just do a really fun overview of the key highlights from this year and the Elakha Alliance, and some fun trivia and giving away prizes. So make sure to sign up for that. You can do that on our website, just like you did for this webinar. We also have a Giving Tuesday campaign that launched yesterday that's going until this Sunday. Our goal is to sell 300 of these spiffy new Elakha Alliance shirts. We're currently, I think, at 138. So if you would like to support us, that would be wonderful. I linked it here, and I can put it in the chat box if you would like to support us and get one of these shirts, long sleeves, or crew neck hoodies. And we also have an Oregon beer challenge. So there's 14 Oregon breweries that are making an otter themed beer. A lot of them are already out in the public. And a portion of those proceeds will be donated to the Elakha Alliance. And we're going to have a really exciting judging party, hopefully at OMSI at the end of January. So stay tuned for those tickets to be on sale. And almost done here. We are on all your favorite social media channels. So if you don't follow us already, please do, on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. And if you haven't signed up for our email newsletter, it goes out once a month to keep you in the know for everything that we're doing. You can do that on our website. And last but not least, I want to introduce our guest speaker this evening, Josie Iselin. She'll take us on a journey as an artist diving deep into the science of seaweed and kelp of our Pacific West Coast. The images and chapters of her book, The Curious World of Seaweed, will be the jumping off point into her current research and artwork concerning the history of kelp surveys and maps. There's also an accompanying exhibit at UBC Beatty Biomuseum, so be on the lookout for that. She is part of the Discovery Channel's and BBC's Earthshot documentary. She's a narrator in the kelp segment of the Revive Our Oceans episode, which is super awesome. Her newest project, entitled Chasing Kelp, will be discussed as it is currently evolving, comparing the underpinnings to storytelling concerning kelp in California versus Oregon. Puget Sound and Alaska are some of her current preoccupations. As a visual artist and storyteller, she is delighted to bring her discussion with the Elakha Alliance community this evening. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to you, Josie.
Thank you, Chanel. I am absolutely delighted to be here with the Elakha Alliance. I have to say how much I appreciate all of the background and the information that you bring to the kelp forest restoration conversation. And as someone from California, it's really one of the main impetuses for this work that I'm going to show tonight is how different the story is up in Oregon versus right across the border in California. So I'm going to just jump right in here and say that Chasing Kelp is the name of this new project and its new work I'm going to be showing with you tonight. But I am doing a presentation on Tuesday evening in conjunction with the Beatty Museum of Biodiversity on the UBC campus in Vancouver, Canada, where a show based on the imagery and work from the Curious World of Seaweed, my most recent book, is on exhibit. So that's a virtual walk through the gallery, and that presentation will very much complement this work, this presentation tonight. And I'm going to compress my usual kind of journey as an artist into the science of seaweed into about 3 slides so that then we can jump off into my work in progress, which is what I'm going to take you with me on today. So I've been scanning the marine algae for many, many years. Probably in 2009, I started using what's called the transparency adapter of my scanner to capture this incredible luminescence of the seaweed and kelp of our Pacific coast. And these kind of pretty graphic images are what made up the visual component to what I call a visual primer on seaweed, which is an Ocean Garden, The Secret Life of Seaweed, which was published in 2014. When the pandemic kind of closed down all the events that I was going to be doing for the new book, The Curious World of Seaweed, I went back into my hard drive and said, I really need to archive all of this this older imagery, and I started building these very high-res amalgamations, what I think of as an intertidal jungle almost, with this kind of early imagery. And these are designed as these very big murals. I made 3 of them. They can be about 80 inches across. And this scanning technique has allowed me to make this seaweed and kelp iconography that I can use and design in all sorts of different ways. So not only are they designed into books, but they are big gallery prints. I can print on fabric, I can do architectural installations. And in this way, I can really bring these seaweeds and kelps of our Pacific coast to kind of an unsuspecting audience, or to a real variety of audiences. And that's really my goal underpinning all of my work. When An Ocean Garden was published, after that was published, I really wanted to dig deeper into some of the history of the science around some of the most iconic seaweeds of our coast. And so I started looking into the taxonomic history, the history of the naming of the seaweeds, and realized that there was this really fantastic visual component to the taxonomic history. And so I started combining my contemporary scans with these historical lithographs. And what you have on the left here is the very first composite that I made, which is my scan of a Costaria kelp on top of this lithograph of Dictionorum that was part of the publication by Franz Josef Ruprecht in 1853 that was naming 5 of the kelps of California and 1 of the seagrasses. And on the right, you have the Fucus disticus, which is our rockweed that is so prevalent in the intertidal. And then I've combined it with this lithograph by Alexander Postels, who created this spectacular folio. He was the artist who paired with Ruprecht to make this folio titled Illustrationes Algarum in 1840. So this work really was kind of the basis for a lot of the research and the writing that went into the chapters of the Curious World in Seaweed. But the underpinnings, this vector between past and present, is something that will come up again and again. And I want to point out that a vector has an arrow on it, and going from past to present is really inferring kind of our pointing out to the future. And I think there's this question that underpins all of my work, which is, where will these organisms be in the future with our warming oceans? And that is the seaweeds and the kelps that I'm referring to. So that kind of looking out to the future is really what undergirds all of this work. So the Curious World of Seaweed came out in 2019. If you don't have it, I hope you do pick it up. Books on seaweed really are hard sellers out there. But what I did was I focused on 16 kelps and seaweeds that any of us would find along the shore, and went pretty deep into the history of the science. I get to highlight a lot of pioneering women scientists, but in each of these chapters, I try to center the seaweed as opposed to us humans in the story. Our humans are there, but we are peripheral. And I've called this kind of an algal-centric perspective. And so I'm trying to take that as well into my future work. The second chapter of the Curious World of Seaweed is about bull kelp, or Nereocystis lutkiana. And this is the image that is the frontispiece to that chapter. And this is one of these spectacular oversized lithographs by Alexander Postels that is part of that 1840 publication entitled Illustrationes Algarum. The actual elephant folio, as it's called, it actually resides in the library, the special collections at USC, where I got to go many years ago and encourage them to digitize the images. So I've been using them all this time. So Alexander Postels was on the exploratory expedition, the Russian exploratory expedition to Alaska in 1829, that was captained by Frederick Lutke. And he was kind of the 4th naturalist on board. I think he was hired as the as the surgeon, and he was trained as a geologist, but he had this incredible affinity for the seaweeds and for drawing and rendering them. The prime naturalist on board that expedition was Henry Mertens, and he wrote quite a bit about the Nereocystis that they collected in Alaska. So the type specimen that they collected and sent back to Russia that was written about by Ruprecht was collected at Sitka Sound. And so that's the type locality in Southeast Alaska, is the type locality for Nereocystis. Here I'm showing you Postel's great rendering of the juvenile Nereocystis, and I've combined it with my scan of these juveniles. And just to say, this is just such a exuberant organism. You can tell we both were struggling with how do you confine such an exuberance onto the confines of a page or the glass platen of my scanner. So the history of the science of the Nereocystis is really compelling. And what I'm giving a little interjection here is to say that I mentioned that type locality, the type specimen being collected in 1829 from Sitka Sound. But in fact, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark collected a specimen of seaweed that turned out to be perhaps should have been the type specimen. And I want to preface things here, and when I talk about taxonomy, that I'm very aware that the taxonomic history of science is very Western facing, and that there's whole other kinds of knowledge that is embedded in indigenous interactions with the kelp that is very, very important, and is part of what I want to be kind of incorporating into this storytelling more. But the taxonomic history being what it was, Meriwether Lewis was collecting all these botanical specimens, and he describes one, this seaweed that they collected. There are two species of the fuci or sea wreck, which we also find thrown up by the waves. The first species at one extremity consists of a large vesicle or hollow vessel, which would contain from 1 to 2 gallons of a conic form, the base of which forms the extreme end and is convex and globular, bearing on its center some short, broad, and irregular fibers. So Meriwether Lewis was this great chronicler of botanical specimens, and what he was describing was actually a Nereocystis with a specimen with a feather boa kelp growing off of it. And Gary Moulton, a Lewis herbarium expert, notes that this description is actually of the two species together. But this would in fact be the first specimen of bull kelp. Another just great Oregon aside here, I've been working with the botanical specimens collected by Meriwether Lewis for the Lewis and Clark herbarium. And they did include one marine algae, and that's this specimen of feather boa kelp, or Egregia menziesii, and it was collected from the mouth of the Columbia River on the Pacific Ocean on November 17th in 1805. So this actually resides in Philadelphia with the 223 other specimens collected by Meriwether Lewis. Just a little tidbit there. So back to the chapter on Nereocystis, I really wanted to highlight this connection between the bull kelp and the sea otter. And Henry Mertens, on that exploratory expedition, he writes about the sea otter and the bull kelp as they saw it in Sitka Sound. And he noted that all of the Russian sailors called the bull kelp sea otter cabbage. And that made sense to him because the sea otters were constantly playing in the bull kelp. They're climbing on the bulbs and jumping off, wrapping themselves in the fronds, keeping their pups within the bull kelp so that the mothers could dive for food. And this was reiterated by this wonderful pioneering woman scientist, Edna Fisher, who in 1938 was the first biologist to be down on the central coast of California, observing the sea otter that had just been rediscovered on the Big Sur coast there. And she was teaching at San Francisco State College, and in fact brought her students down to camp and help her collect observational data about the behavior of the of the sea otter. And then she wrote some seminal papers that in fact confirmed many things that the local tribes had been saying all along about how sea otters use tools to eat their food and such. So this connection between the bull kelp in particular and the sea otter, I think, is something that's always worth reminding ourselves of. Again, this is another drawing by Edna Fisher. She is not known that well, so being able to bring her to light is something that is my pleasure. And that chapter, I also go into great detail on the life cycle of the bull kelp, which in terms of the natural history, these restoration efforts, thinking about the resilience and ecology in general is very important. And bull kelp, unlike the giant kelp, is an annual. It lives for 12, 18, 20 to 24 months. And then it is picked up by the winter storms and cast either into the deeper ocean or onto the shore, and it becomes part of the whole nearshore ecology. But it has to reproduce before that happens to survive. So it produces these sori, or dark spore patches, along its blades, and by late summer, these dense sori, dense with millions and millions of spores in each packet, fall away to the ocean floor and develop into a sexual phase of the life cycle of the bull kelp. And these gametophytes, these male and female organisms, are microscopic and actually generate sperm and egg, and the sperm underneath the ocean waters follows a pheromone trail to fertilize the egg, the female, and that in turn grows into the great sporophyte bull kelp that we know. So this abstraction of the sori is something that to me not only is visually lovely, but it really recalls or references that kind of magical life cycle, part of which is very, very mysterious to us and even to scientists. Bull kelp is easily reproduced in the lab, but this other microscopic phase is more mysterious in real life. So there's an ephemeral quality to the bull kelp as an annual. And this ephemeralness of bull kelp and other kelp is, I think, really important to remember, because the bull kelp are not part of the fossil record. And really all kelp and seaweeds are not part of the fossil record. And so kelp are left out of whole disciplines of science that rely on fossils, such as archaeology, paleontology, anthropology. Its old-time story can be inferred indirectly from midden content of shells or bones, but that is only since the relatively recent comprehension of the relationship of kelp to those remains found, i.e. otter, urchin, and abalone. So that in and of itself makes teasing out the old-time history, ecological history of kelp that much harder. And that is one of the challenges that this crazy mosaic is introducing, is how do we tell stories across time, in deep time, about the bull kelp ecology. And bull kelp is the mainstay of a complex ecological web that involves many, many organisms. But there are three that play out again and again in the story of the bull kelp forest of the North Pacifics: sea otter, abalone, and sea urchin. The trophic interactions between these four, bull kelp as primary producer, sea otter as top predator, and both abalone and sea urchin as herbivores dependent on kelp but hunted by sea otter, create fascinating ecological stories in and of themselves. But when each of these animals' complex relationships to us humans is added to the mix, both indigenous prehistorical humans and contemporary fisheries-focused humans, the stories get really interesting. They can, in fact, kind of turn into parables. And so you'll notice I have us in there. And so my idea for this, my kind of ongoing work, is how do we tell these deeply historical, ecological narratives across the full range of the bull kelp? So across from Central California, Northern California, through the Pacific Northwest, British Columbia, Southeast Alaska, Western Alaska, through to the Aleutian Islands where the range ends. So can we tell these stories that go not only geographically across space, but also go across time? And that is the goal for this book proposal that I have been working on for a number of years now. That was initially called Chasing Kelp, but that was a little derivative of Chasing Coral, and got switched to An Ocean Entanglement, Bull Kelp, Sea Otter, Urchin, and Abalone, the ecological story of the kelp forest from Central California to the Aleutian Islands. So I think as all of this restoration work on the bull kelp is happening now, and there's been this incredible resurgence of research and surveying and interest in kelp restoration, it would be very, very useful to have some context for these kelp stories from all these different locations across the range of the bull kelp. And so my proposal is to go to each of these places and dig up these stories, not only have a personal be able to snorkel in the kelp in each of these places, but also to meet with the scientists, meet with tribal or indigenous members, and build these kind of more complex stories. So the idea is to start in Monterey Bay. The north coast of California is where all of my writing thus far has been centered, and that's that chapter from the Curious World of Seaweed. And I also wrote another essay that was published in a literary magazine from Santa Cruz, Catamaran, and then up to Oregon, where you all have such a different take on kelp restoration and resilience, because the sea otter is forefronted in your stories, whereas just a few hundred miles to the south, the sea otter is really not part of that conversation. Up into Puget Sound, which has so much interesting things happening, Vancouver Island, Haida Gwaii, Sitka Sound in Southeast Alaska, Prince William Sound, Kodiak Island, and to the very end of the range in Umnak Island, where in 1989, Kathy Ann Miller really kind of wrote the paper that said, this is the last stop for bull kelp. So in all of these places have a unique combination of cold Pacific Ocean, historical bull kelp or Nereocystis beds, abalone sea urchins and sea otters, or maybe not sea otters, situated in a unique geography of shoreline. Each place also has unique human interactions with its marine systems, like fisheries with commercial value, communities that rely on fishing as a dominant livelihood, or communities that rely on shellfish harvesting for basic sustenance. This mixture of characters plays out in a unique geography of each locale. And at this precarious moment in time, when the primary producer in the system, the bull kelp, is all of a sudden been noticed as the critical player it is, cooperation, listening in from region to region, taking notes of what's happening to the north and to the south is very important. So that is my goal for this project, is seeing if I can tease out these pretty complex layered stories. And being that it's a geographic exploration, I thought, wow, in terms of developing the visual iconography that usually is what drives my research, wouldn't it be cool to use maps? And since we're going back and forward in time, wouldn't it be cool to research historical maps and see what there is? So as a point of departure in my visual explorations, I'm using the kelp maps published in 1915 by the US Department of Agriculture, when they funded these surveys of the kelp of our Pacific coast. And this was because of their potential as sources of potassium or potash for the fertilizer industry. So there was this great sense of commercial possibility to the kelp of our West Coast. That disappeared as soon as chemical fertilizers were introduced. But lo and behold, we have these maps and a report that went along with them that was telling us, that included these charts that are on the right here. So each of the numbered beds that we'll see in the maps actually is named, and the kind of kelp that is comprised of N stands for Nereocystis and MAC for macrocystis. And whether it was the density, whether it was thin, very thin, medium, or heavy. H is heavy and very heavy. So here's an example of a close-up of two of the maps, one from the Mendocino coast in California. I've chosen kelp bed number 35 at Saunders Reef. This is a persistent kelp bed that is one of the few that was labeled heavy, that purple color, at the time in 1912. So the entire lower 48 were surveyed in the summer of 1912. The lower from Mexico up into Southern California was surveyed in 1911, and then Alaska was surveyed in 1913, in 1912 and 1913. So I've been at Saunders Landing, at Saunders Reef, and been on the cliffs looking out at this amazing bed of kelp, and wondered if the bull kelp that's there now is kind of the progeny, many, many generations later, of kelp that was there in 1912. Up on the Oregon coast, here is Cape Blanco and Port Orford, and there are these kelp beds labeled number 11 and number 12. If we go to the charts, they do tell us that it's Nereocystis. On the Oregon coast, all of the beds were either thin or very thin, and on the California coast, that Saunders Reef is really one of the only heavy beds along the coast there. So fun stuff. So the report that goes along with this 1912 survey has some really interesting things in it. And this really caught my eye. This was a number of years ago when I first read this. It's reported it happens that this year, 1912, was an unusually poor one for a kelp harvest. Most of the beds were thinner than usual, and especially along the northern coast section, some beds being very thin and practically non-existent, where usually very heavy stands prevail. From general testimony, it may be taken that conditions this year represented about the minimum kelp harvest the western coast of the United States produces, and normal average stands distinctly larger. It goes on to say that the thickness of the beds varies sometimes considerably from year to year. There is an impression prevailing commonly among the fishermen that the growth follows a 3-year cycle, a thin stand being followed by a medium, then a heavy one, and a return the 4th year to a light stand. That such a cycle exists lacks confirmation by competent trained observers, but there's no doubt whatever that the crop of kelp does vary considerably from year to year. And this is, the author then goes on to really kind of call out the lighthouse keepers, the seamen, the local fishermen that are really important sources of information on the kelp. And I love that we now have really good confirmation of this cyclical nature of the bull kelp on our Pacific coast. And this is a graph from the paper by Meredith McPherson. Meredith is a newly minted PhD out of UC Santa Cruz. I got to help her one weekend in Mendocino actually measure bull kelp biomass. And she has taken the Landsat data and determined that after 1985, that's when the Landsat satellite data can really be useful in terms of determining bull kelp biomass on the surface, and shows, and this is the summed kelp canopy for the north coast of California, Sonoma and Mendocino counties together, and that you can see it's incredibly cyclical. And then towards 2016, 2017, 2018, that's when we had the perfect storm of events, the warming oceans, the blob, the El Nino, and the starfish wasting disease. And 2020 and 2021 should show a small recovery of the bull kelp. But I'm very conscious that this cyclical nature of the bull kelp really does not get to be included when we're telling the general story of the bull kelp. And especially when articles come out in the newspaper about the demise of the bull kelp on our north coast of California, there's this constant reprise of 95% of the kelp is gone. And when you have a graph like this in your mind, 95% doesn't mean that much? 95% of what? And is the average something that is meaningful? So having this context to these conversations and these stories, to me, is really, really important. So here's my project. I really want to go to each of these places, and I've started. I was in Monterey in March of 2020, right as the pandemic was kind of closing things down. On the right, what you have is what in the 1912 survey is the southernmost bed of Nereocystis. It's just about at San Luis Obispo, that bed number 81. So that's the southern range of bull kelp. And then Monterey is really where I would start my storytelling. And Monterey not only has so many ecological stories going on with the return of the sea otter, the existence of kelp and urchin and sea otter in that ecology, but also there's the social layers of the history of the abalone fishery in Monterey, which is so interesting and complex. And I have to reference here the amazing book by Anne Valisis on abalone. It's just a must read for some of this cultural history around the abalone in California, which is such a layered story. And certainly in Monterey, you have the beginning of the abalone fishery with the Japanese divers and the Chinese divers around Monterey. So it's a complex story, and I was experimenting. And again, I'm taking you on my journey as I experiment with this visual imagery, trying to find something that works, that visually represents the complexity of these stories. And what I've done here is layered 3 different kelp maps. One is that 1912 survey with kelp bed number 52 up in the upper right, kelp bed number 53 on the outer coast of Point Pinos. And then there's also an 1880s map in here. And what you see over on the left is the hand-drawn, I'll see if my cursor actually works over there. Yeah, this hand-drawn kelp squiggle that designates the outer kelp bed outside of Point Pinos. And then these colored polygons are from the 1989 to 2016 aerial surveys that were done by the California Fish and Wildlife Agency. The data is available to all, and I put that data into a QGIS or open source GIS program and was able to color each year differently and come up with this kind of imagery for that late 20th century, early 21st century kelp surveys. It's a mishmash, but part of the idea is that it's a very deep story. And part of what I want to do with each of these locations is go there and have an interaction with the bull kelp itself. And there is a new bull kelp bed in Monterey that arose in 2019, 2020, right about where that FW is on the upper right of this map. And it's right where the John Denver Memorial plaque is, because it's right off the beach where John Denver's small plane crashed. So that's kind of how I locate it. And there is, in fact, I spent a whole afternoon observing this beautiful new patch of bull kelp that arose there. The thinking is that the urchins moved in towards shore, opening up the possibility for bull kelp to reemerge in the deeper waters. And then sure enough, there were a couple of sea otter out there playing around. And part of the ecological story here comes from the work that Josh Smith has recently published, and his dissertation that he is another newly minted PhD out of UC Santa Cruz, and his research is so interesting, and I know he's shared it with the Elakha Alliance on how the sea otter really will maintain their foraging within the kelp forest, but they will not forage outside in the urchin barrens. And then that kind of helps maintain a mosaic of kelp patches. And that's the case in and around Monterey right now. So I got to meet with Josh on that weekend and had a long talk about his work that would be incorporated into this Monterey chapter. And then the idea is that I would collect some piece of kelp that was from that particular spot, that particular kelp bed that I was interacting with, and make a cyanotype out of it. And this is the cyanotype of this large, squiggly, wonderful dried bull kelp that was on that beach where right by the John Denver Memorial plaque. And so then I thought, well, can I combine this cyanotype print with the maps? And I'm going to be honest with you here. I'm showing you work that doesn't work. I'm really taking you along on my process as an artist and as a designer. And a lot of it comes down to what works and what doesn't. And a lot of things don't work. And so you have to regroup. And I tried again with a different cyanotype of a different specimen of Nereocystis. This one is from Fort Funston, which is where I walk very regularly here in San Francisco. And this works a little bit better. But what I find again and again is I have to just keep backing off, and that simpler images actually work the best. And this, I think, is something that really starts to work as an image. And this is just the QGIS overlays of those the kelp survey data from 1989 to 2016. So back to the book project and going from up the coast along the range of the bull kelp. Again, Saunders Landing or the Mendocino coast is kind of home base for a lot of my storytelling. And I've been at it for a long time and was really fascinated by the very first presentations about the perfect storm that gave rise to the urchin barrens that have taken over a lot of our Northern California coast. I was always really fascinated by a lot of the first presentations, and even many of the presentations now. There's no otter in the story. And I would kind of be raising my hand and say, why is the context of the sea otter not being around on our West Coast? Why is that not included? And the sociological kind of trappings of the abalone fishery, the recreational abalone fishery on the north coast of California is very strong, and I think a fascinating part of the story. And again, I come back to Anne's book on abalone and the history around the abalone and the emotion that surrounds abalone in California, and how it's really just a fabrication of having no otter in the system for so long. Anyway, I was looking for, again, ways to get us visually into the story. What were the kelp beds like on the Mendocino coast? So I chose Saunders Landing here, where there was that kelp bed. In 1912, kelp bed number 35. And you can see this is an 1880s chart. The NOAA website is incredibly robust with historical nautical surveys. And once you start to recognize these kelp squiggles as indicating these kelp beds, it becomes a treasure hunt on the NOAA site. So this is an 1880s nautical hydrologic survey. And you can see this profound miles-long kelp bed is indicated here. I've highlighted it in yellow, and then I've shown you this slightly larger version so you can see actually what it looks like. It's these hand-drawn squiggles. Become incredibly obsessed with finding the hand-drawn squiggles on these kelp nautical charts. Again, here's another exploration on my part to try to find some form of delightful imagery using these maps that will make us want to dive into a story, whether it's on the pages of a book, the walls of a gallery, parts of an ArcGIS story map. What will spark our interest? And here I've overlaid that 1880s hydrologic survey with the 1912 kelp maps, kelp bed indicators in that same area around Saunders Reef. Here's a different experiment, again, in the context of the page. of a book proposal. Here I'm looking at elk on the Mendocino coast, which is where I have, as I drive down from Fort Bragg and Mendocino, I will often stop in Elk. And there's this whole history of kelp, as you can see, from 89 to 2016. There's this incredible history, colorful history indicated here. But the kelp now is incredibly minimal. And the last time I was at the Greenwood Beach here, Greenwood State Park Creek Beach, there was only this small patch of bull kelp that was inside Gunderson Rock there. And what was so extraordinary about being there with that bull kelp was that it was growing out of the sand. And there were numerous bull kelp that were literally coming up out of the sand at the low tide mark. And I tried to reach my arm down to find the holdfast on some rocky substrate, and I couldn't. It was too far down there. But I encounter again and again in other kelp patches that I go to one kelp bed at Point Reyes very regularly, where the kelp is very close to shore, and I encounter kelp on the beach that really only has a stipe of maybe a couple of feet long. Well, this is quite a remarkable thing. So having that personal connection to the place that the map is indicating is something that I need to explore with words. And this is where the word and image, the science and art, I'm really trying to figure out the ways to bring them together. So here I've kind of put across time an 1880s kelp survey. This is Gunderson Rock here, Gunderson Rock here, and Gunderson Rock here. This is an 1880s survey with the kelp indicated out here in the outer waters. This is what you just saw, those aerial surveys on a contemporary chart. So these little squiggles are from the contemporary chart. And then I just went to Google Earth from 2020, and you can see there's very little kelp there at all. Again, these are all experiments. And really my own personal experience in tying these stories together, I think is really important. And my own experience with these very short stiped bull kelp in particular reminded me of reading a number of years ago this description by William Albert Setchels in the Botanical Gazette of 1908. So Setchel was the director of the botany department at UC Berkeley until 1915. And he really was the grandfather of seaweed study on our West Coast, and in particular in California. And here he's trying to tease out whether the Nereocystis that's been described by many people is just one species. And he goes back to Mertens in 1829 and notes that Merton describes stipes that reach a length of 45 faden or fathoms, making in all something approaching 90 meters, and that the Aleuts use them for fishing lines, one of which he himself bought. I've seen these fishing lines. They oil the stipes, these very thin and long stipes, and they're so that they stay malleable. But Setchels is also looking at, Ruprecht thought that this might be, there was this incredible difference in stipe length from Nereocystis in California to the Nereocystis described in Alaska, and he thought it might be two. This impressed Ruprecht to such an extent that he suggested that the southern smaller plant might belong to a different species. So Setchel is again looking to fishermen and people, different accounts of the Nereocystis, and including his own. The longest specimen in reasonably perfect condition I ever found cast ashore was on the beach at Carmel Bay in Monterey County, California. Not having a tape line, I resorted to pacing. Its greatest length was 41 good paces, which by measurement of my average pace fully equals that number of meters. So certainly I have paced off, I'm sure all of you who encounter bull kelp on our shores, you can't help but pace off a big, long, mature bull kelp that you encounter. But 41 paces, that's 120 feet. That's really long. I'm not sure I've ever encountered a bull kelp that has a stipe that long. So this incredibly this plasticity to the bull kelp stipe, that it can be well, 90 meters long to a couple of feet as I've encountered it. And there is a mechanism that is one of these kind of magical growth mechanisms whereby the bull kelp, as the bladder is reaching towards the surface to get its blades closer to the sunlight for efficient photosynthesis, once the bulb reaches the surface, the meristem, or the growth mechanism, shifts from the stipe up to the blades, and the stipe then stops growing. So as soon as that bulb encounters the surface, the stipe does stop growing. And that's how this, but this is my kind of love affair with the incredible magnificence of the bull kelp stipe in all of its squiggly glory. This was a show I did last year at this time in a small gallery right near the beach here in San Francisco. And I kind of wanted to pull the rack line into this installation space. And it was really fun. Lots of kids would, stop by, and it was a great way to kind of say, this is what's right out there at the beach. So as we continue to march up the coast along the geographic range of the bull kelp, we get to Oregon, where you guys are doing such amazing work here. If we go up to Puget Sound in Washington, there's this huge 1912, this huge bed south of Cape Flattery. But Puget Sound has all of its own stories. And I want to point out that the Puget Sound Restoration Fund is doing just amazing work around kelp restoration and oyster restoration in Puget Sound. They've put together this incredible story map. I mean, really amazing work that really does go back and forward in time and across the geography of Puget Sound. I'm showing here the kelp bed at Freshwater Bay in the Straits of Juan de Fuca, where the Elwha River comes out, and again, a 1941 map with all these kelp squiggles just on the other side of Port Angeles there. But the place I really want to go in Puget Sound is down to Squaxin Island, and there is a refugial kelp bed, bull kelp bed, way in the very southern part of Puget Sound that I think it would be interesting to note the genetic composition of the kelp that are persisting there. And I also would really love to connect with the tribal community there and learn more about their relationship with the bull kelp. And I want to say that through this whole project, one of my goals is to really learn about the different kinds of relationships to the bull kelp, in particular by Native Californians, First Nations in British Columbia, and the Indigenous Alaskans in their places, because all of these stories present really important ways of knowing the bull kelp that need to be incorporated into all of these stories. So if we keep moving up, the Haida Gwaii, the Guayhanas, we'll go to Vancouver Island, the west coast of Vancouver Island. I referenced in my the last chapter in the Curious World of Seaweed. A wonderful scientist, Jane Watson, has done very long-term surveys there, and there are new bull kelp surveys that are starting to happen in Barkley Sound. There's places where there have been otter and there have not been otter. And if we move up to Haida Gwaii and Guayhanas, the marine reserve there that is managed jointly between the Haida Nation and Parks Canada. There's all sorts of restoration going on there. Lynn Lee has done presentations, I think, for you all. And there's really interesting work where Haida elders are really looking for the old time relationships between sea otter and First Nations tribes, and how were those relationships building an ecology that served everybody. And Anne Solomon has done amazing work. I could name all sorts of people there. If we keep moving up to the type locality, Southeast Alaska for bull kelp, the 1912 surveys didn't get into Sitka Sound, but they did survey farther east where there's so much kelp. You can see that the kelp beds are reaching into the thousands. And what struck me about what's so different up there was on my Instagram feed a couple of years ago, I started following Barnacle Foods. And Barnacle Foods is a small company that harvests bull kelp and makes pickle out of it and sells it to the whole country. And I was aghast as a Californian, where every blade of bull kelp seems to be sacred, that there was enough bull kelp to start this pickling operation, and their business is burgeoning. And they're also farming as well, and are very, very knowledgeable about the ecology of, but it's very different up there. There's been otter in that system for a long time. And why the otter restoration worked in Southeast Alaska and did not work on the Oregon coast is definitely part of the story. And then if we continue up to Kodiak Island, I have a good friend who's an archaeologist who works for the Elakha Museum up there, and he paddles around all of these kelp beds. He's connected with the elders there, and has all sorts of interesting insights into the relationship between bull kelp and macrocystis, because I think Kodiak is the northernmost point of the range of macrocystis giant kelp. And of course, I had to go look through NOAA to see what kind of historical maps I could find for this particular spot between Kodiak and Afognak Island, where Whale Island is. And there's a 1907 map for just that area with lots of kelp squiggles in it. And back in Sitka, there's lots and lots of kelp in and around Sitka Point. It's designated in 1928 with the kelp squiggles. And I know there's lots of research going on in Sitka between the marine labs there and the Coast Guard Academy and local fishermen that are surveying the abalone and the urchins there. So it's really important that we dig into these deep ecological histories, as well as the, as well as the cultural histories between these organisms. And just to finish up here, I want to really just go back to the Oregon coast. Some of my experiments with, again, imagery, combining my scans, my cyanotypes, and these historical maps. Again, I'm always really trying to be honest with myself in what works and what isn't working. Here, I thought this is more successful if we go to Yaquina Head and look at this chart from 1912, 1927, where you can see I've highlighted the kelp bed there, and in 1938 at a slightly smaller scale. But is it working with this cyanotype? And what I've, again, kind of pared back to is that, and again, taking my muse from the book format itself, I came up with this layout, which with some of the text that I've written from some of the introductions. I have numerous introductions to this book, so I've been reading a little bit from that introduction. And yesterday I was reading the report that accompanies the 1912 kelp survey of the Pacific coastal waters done by the US Department of Agriculture. It was commented that the Nereocystis around the Straits of Juan de Fuca is generally in 30 to 40 feet of water, with nematocysts generally 7 to 8 inches across. I'm not sure I've ever seen a bull kelp with a bladder that big. Is the kelp that we know generally smaller than the kelp of the past? Nereocystis requires tremendous nutrient uptake to grow into its massive mature form. Could the generally warming, less nutrient dense ocean mean generally smaller kelp? Is anyone watching or measuring? If the trees in the forest started shrinking, wouldn't we notice? Mia Tegner actually tagged and measured stipes of macrocystis in the kelp forests off La Jolla. She discovered that from 1957 to 1995, while there were similar numbers of giant kelp in a given meter squared, the density of each individual stipe was much thinner. So the overall carrying capacity of the kelp forest, the carbon sequestered, and other support the kelp provides was greatly reduced. I can't help but wonder if the Nereocystis we know, the mature year-old or older Nereo that we think seems so massive, is really just a ghost of what was normal 150 years ago. So Mia Tegner is someone who has really been a touchstone for me in terms of this storytelling. And again, here I'm bringing together a whole bunch of a mosaic of the historical maps of the Oregon coast and combining it with some of the newer scans. Mia Tegner actually died tragically in 2001 in a diving accident. She really kind of did this historical ecology in a way around the kelp forest that is very, very inspiring to me going forward. This was an image that I made at the height of the loss of kelp on the Northern California coast. And when this perfect storm, when the urchin barrens were really kind of making themselves known up on the Mendocino coast. And I write about Mia Tegner in my introduction in terms of these ghosts and this ghost that I'm alluding to in this image. Excuse me. In 1989, Mia Tegner, a brilliant marine biologist at the height of her career, published a paper with her collaborators, Paul Dayton and others, titled Sliding Baselines, Ghosts, and Reduced Expectations in Kelp Forest Communities. Mia had grown up in San Diego, gone to college there, and eventually gotten her PhD at Scripps. She in molecular biology, but she traded in the molecular biology for marine ecology and spent the next decades in the kelp forest off San Diego, thinking about long-term trends and how to quantify a healthy kelp forest ecology. She writes that trying to assess the state of a kelp forest has three challenges. First, there needs to be a good foundation against which changes can be measured or marked, a baseline. Yet we have a tendency to keep redefining what that baseline is, to resubscribe normal to what is at hand at present. She points out that we have no recordings of what the kelp forests were like before the big keystone animals were removed. And I'm quoting her here. The wholesale removal of fish, crab, abalone, red sea urchin, rockfish, and long ago the sea otter for our human consumption have compromised our ability to understand a natural kelp forest system. And even if the kelp forest persists without these species, she states, it is very important to acknowledge their absence. She also writes one needs to distinguish between anthropogenic and natural changes. And she mentions these big natural events such as El Nino and a huge storm of 1988. But she describes the anthropogenic factors affecting the kelp forest, starting with fishing by primitive people, citing papers on urchin and abalone residue in shell middens, suggesting that the resident Chumash tribes regularly hunted otter, thus affecting abalone and urchin populations, thus affecting kelp abundance. Tegner was creating an historical ecology, an attempt to factor back farther in time to create a broader picture of what a kelp forest can be and what it might need for resilience through catastrophic periods. Even if there isn't a seen effect of the absence of a piece of the ecological system, the missing pieces, or ghosts, as she called them, must be recognized. And I want to point out here too that I've been really, I think she is really alluding to the fact that we humans, even in ancient prehistorical times, have been mining resilience out of these ecologies for centuries. And all of our attempts right now in all the research and kelp restoration that we're doing is trying to pump resilience back into these kelp forests. But we have to remind ourselves, I think being constantly reminded of the history is important, and that we have in fact, and still do, pull resilience out, and that kind of idea of that we've been excavating the resilience or mining the resilience is something I come back to again and again, and is why I keep making these different kinds of images about the bull kelp. I had a chance just before the pandemic to cast a small piece of bull kelp. I scraped the money together. It's very expensive to cast bronze, but this was something I'd wanted to do for a long time. I worked with a wonderful foundry in Berkeley and cast one of my small kelp squiggles. And my goal is I would love to get the commission to do a large scale bronze kelp sculpture that could be climbed on by children, sat on by people, have a tactile experience with this, but on our bringing the kelp again into our terrestrial world. And these are some more recent scans. They're scanned at very large resolutions so that they can be very big, so that I can work with them in all sorts of different contexts and design installations. These were collected at Portuguese Beach, where I was snorkeling when I was being filmed for the Earthshot documentary there. So these were collected just this spring. And here again, I'm back to trying to explore combining these cyanotypes with the maps. And I actually brought those scans together and realized that this is actually the piece that actually really works. And I'm going to finish here. I know I thank you all for your patience, but I really just want to read one Haida story that I think sums up a lot of my feelings about why we need to connect with the bull kelp, not only across time, but across space. And in 1905, John Swanton recorded stories and texts translated from the Skidgate dialect used by the Haida First Nations people of Haida Gwaii. He records one that involves a two-headed bull kelp. The son of a village chief has gambled and lost his father's entire village. He runs away and floats away from the village on an enormous cedar beam. After a couple of days floating about in calm ocean water, he runs into a two-headed bull kelp and hears a voice calling. It is a voice from under the water. He grabs the heads of the kelp and follows the stipes like a double-headed house pole down to the ocean floor. There he is invited into the house of his powerful grandfather, who says, "You came floating about in search of me as soon as you had lost your father's town." He feeds his grandson and prompts him to find some appropriate wood to make two gambling sticks. One the wine's grandfather inscribes with an otter and the other with a young otter. These sticks the grandson takes back up to the town and wins back his father's people and town. While the story itself is steeped in process and gambling details that do not make sense to me, ethnobotanist Nancy Turner, who has worked for decades with First Nations tribes of British Columbia, interprets the two-headed kelp as believed to mark the entrance to a supernatural world under the ocean where wisdom is found and brought back to the surface. So a two-headed bull kelp is rare, but not impossible to find. It's a mutant. I have a few specimens of these oddities given to me by my friend Lena, who I walk the beach with regularly. One has both bladders right near the top, almost like Siamese twins, and another has split midway up the stipe into two stipes, like the two-headed house pole. While we can conjecture what DNA glitch created the rare mutation of two pneumatocysts, I like to think that they are an occasional sign. The double-headed bull kelp is beckoning us into its world, to seed us with its wisdom, or the wisdom of the ocean around its holdfast, where we cannot see the bull kelp's alternate generation at work, its spores having germinated into a microscopic entity that has all the possibility of the majestic kelp in its few cells. Or perhaps it is the voice of the laughing grandfather who sees us having gambled away our town, our planet, saying, here is an alternative way to gamble and win it back. So with that, I want to thank you on coming on this journey with me. This is the first time I've presented any of this material. So thank you if I've been way too long-winded. These are my books, The Curious World of Seaweed and An Ocean Garden. The Curious World of Seaweed is available at bookstores everywhere. And I have all the remaining copies of An Ocean Garden. So please find your local bookstore if you don't have The Curious World of Seaweed already. I will stop sharing there, and I hope that you all have been putting questions into the Q&A or have questions in the chat. And Chanel, I hope we have time for some questions.
Yeah. We sure do. Thank you, Josie. That was fascinating. I actually closed my eyes while you were talking about that story with the two-headed bull kelp, and just visually my mind went crazy with it, and it was really fascinating. That was a great story. Thanks for sharing that. But yes, we do have some questions here in the chat. I have been talking a little with Rosa, who I want to allow to speak. Let me see if I can do that. I've never done it during a presentation. But while I'm figuring that out, let me just ask a question in the meantime. Let's see. Steph says, hello, natural science illustrator here. I know scientific research and writings can be hard for the general public to understand. She loves your idea of using historic maps. Are there other ways you are thinking about visualizing your findings to make your stories and and accessible to a wide range of learners?
Yes, so I've shown you my explorations. I think visually representing actual data is really important. I teach in the School of Design at San Francisco State, so my students are doing all sorts of research, and I'm constantly encouraging them to make icons, to make the data and their survey results visual. But I'm really sticking within, for me right now, I'm sticking with the cyanotypes, the scans that I do, but I also really want to collaborate with other illustrators. One of the ideas for this book is that to understand these ecological stories, you really need to know, say, how the sea urchin reproduce and the abalone reproduce, that they don't actually just they're not like fish where they have populations that restore every year. They're broadcast spawners and have very sporadic population bursts. And that has really huge ramifications for fisheries, et cetera. So I was thinking that while telling those stories, it would be great to work with an illustrator who could be illustrating the urchin and the abalone, et cetera. And I would love to be working with graphic designers. I want to bring in, I'm not fixed to the book format, although for me, I am a bookmaker and the book format does drive. You can see some of my most successful images there were from kind of a book derived format. So, but collaboration with graphics, getting good graphics going is a huge part of this process. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. All right, Rosa, I think you have the opportunity to speak.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Dalaha, hello, my name is Rosa Lauchi. I'm the marine biologist for the Tolowa Dene Nation up in Smith River, California. Our ancestral territory actually goes way up into Oregon. It goes just above Port Orford to the Sixes River. Although Oregon does not recognize us as an Oregon tribe, we still claim ancestral territory all the way up there. So we do have a word for sea otters. It's Tawnit Shrinit. So it is a part of our culture. And if you would ever like to swing by Smith River, I'd be happy to show you around. And if it's a nice day out, we can go snorkel and see some of our spots. And I'm actually monitoring an urchin spot and a kelp bed right now. We don't have a lot of urchins up here, but I have found this one spot at Point St. George that is just inundated with urchins. We haven't, like you said, we haven't had sea otters here for quite some time. We have river otters, but they don't really do much for the urchin population.
Right.
So,
well, Rosa, it's so nice to meet you. Thank you. I would love to take you up on your invitation. Please make sure I can put my contact information back up on the screen here. Please be in touch with me. One of the things I'm fascinated by, and in one of my chapters of The Curious World, I really try to find some of the tribal names for some of the kelps. And whether there's any names for bull kelp in particular, whether it's just edible seaweed versus inedible seaweed, those are really, oh man, that would be really cool to find out.
Yeah, absolutely. Bull kelp is kush, and our edible seaweed, which is a pyropia species or porphyra, change that name, is lot. So yeah, I'd be happy to share those with you.
Great. Well, thank you for connecting. I will absolutely be coming to visit.
Great.
As this project unfolds.
I would love that. That would be wonderful. And thank you so much for this. This was absolutely a great way to end my work day.
Oh, fantastic.
Thanks, Rosa.
That's dope.
Okay, here on to some more questions. If you're sticking around here, Brian is a GIS analyst, sorry, long day. And he's really loving your maps. And he also said he read Home Waters by David B. Williams.
Mm-hmm.
There's an excellent chapter about kelp in the Puget
Yeah.
Sound, and it's really fascinating. So if anybody's interested, they should grab
Yeah,
that
Home
book.
Waters is a great book. I've read most of the book, but it definitely, the kelp chapter, it's all about Puget Sound. So yeah, very good recommendation there.
Martha, oh, sorry.
And everybody should be in touch with me. I'm going to just put my email back up here. I'm on Instagram. I very much like conversing through Instagram or through email. But definitely, if we don't get to your questions now, please be in touch with me because I really, this is how I grow. And I would love to talk. I think maps are just such an interesting thing. I've been thinking a lot about what we learn and what we don't learn from maps and the difference between looking at a map and then being in a place. That conceptual kind of coming together is a really interesting experience. And these are all things I kind of want to write about. And writing as an artist, bringing the science and art together, I'm very conscious of what writing does well and what the artwork does well, and how can I find that perfect, as you can see, it's hard to find those matches, but every once in a while a page really works or something really works, and you have to kind of jump on that and build off of that.
Great. Martha asks, can you possibly project this to the potential of reintroduction of otters to Oregon? So that's kind of a heavy question. And she also wants to know the slide of algae on the first slide. Where is it available?
Oh, I'll go back to here because I like to be speaking to you guys. The first slide, that is an image I've really come, it's one that really works and has become kind of the moniker for this project, Chasing Kelp. That is available on my website. So a lot of this newer work, where I've taken the cyanotype and I've laid in my scan within the cyanotype, again, creating this dialogue across time from this historical process of the cyanotype printing to the scanning. Those are on my website, and I've recently rebuilt my website in conjunction with this show that has just opened up in Vancouver. And that show is very exciting to me because it really is bringing the art and science together in a way that's pretty robust. There's a website, they've produced a website that has lots of the text for each image. It also has video from the intertidal zone done by my friend Patrick Martone. And it has specimens from the collection also incorporated into not only the website, but also the exhibit. So my website has all of those images available. So go to my website, that first prints page, art prints. If you scroll down, you should find that long Chasing Kelp image. If you don't find something, just email me, be in touch.
Oh, so her first question, can you possibly project this to the potential of sea otter reintroduction in Oregon?
Well, the Oregon, having Oregon be one of the points along the range, it would definitely be a chapter. And I think the work that the Elakha Alliance is doing is the source material for so much. So it would be taking one of the questions that is interesting to me is, why isn't there a recreational abalone fishery in Oregon? My understanding is that there are few fishers of abalone. There's not the diving community, and part of that has to do with the range of the abalone that ends up partway through, and there could be other reasons as well. So the work of the Elakha Alliance is really would drive kind of the chapter or that part of the story. And it could be that this whole project is really just bringing different groups together in some kind of way. So the book idea could be a more amorphous concept, or a different concept, a story map or something like that.
I want to plug in here real quick. We have a video with the Oregon Zoo coming out tomorrow on December 2nd that features some footage of us diving with bull kelp off of Port Orford at Redfish Rocks. And there's some really beautiful imagery. And if you're on this call, you probably really love kelp and want to see that. So we'll post that on our YouTube tomorrow and on our social media as well. So be sure to check that out. Donna asked, do you know if there's many kelp surveys that include both Macrocystis and Nereocystis, so giant kelp and bull kelp together?
So there's all sorts of kelp surveys going on right now, and I believe there was a presentation somewhere. There's Kelp Watch, which is using satellite data. There's the Nature Conservancy is doing in California, which is where the Nereocystis and Macrocystis probably come together the most. The Nature Conservancy is doing all sorts of drone surveys in conjunction with the Farallones National Marine Sanctuary, I believe. So Rieta and Vienna are very much doing that. And this is all material that's just coming out now. So I think if you get onto our Kelper calls, which is this consortium of scientists working on kelp restoration, you will learn lots about these kelp surveys that are done and distinguishing. I've been listening in. I'm not an expert on satellite, parsing satellite pixels as to whether a canopy, kelp canopy is Macrocystis or Nereocystis. So I think that's something that they're working through. And I think it's part of this effort to go local, to get much, much better resolution by using drones.
Yes. Awesome. There's a question. When is the gallery opening in Vancouver? When
that is opened. It opened on the 18th of November, and it's going to run through the 24th of April. So it will run through the spring. And you can go to the website now. It's all linked on my website. But please go to Vancouver. It's a fantastic museum, BD Biodiversity Museum. And of course, then you have the great Anthropology Museum on the other end of the UBC campus, which no one should miss if they're up there.
Awesome. Well, there are lots of great comments gushing about your talk this evening. So thank you so much for joining. And lots of people are saying all good things about eating kelp and makes great holiday gifts. So that's wonderful. Let's see, in Vancouver, what specific day will you be there?
So I am doing this virtual talk next Tuesday, but the thought is that I would be going up in February and doing not only a talk, I think February 17th is what we've put tentatively on the calendar. Of course, borders could close again, with everything that's happening. So we have to stay flexible, but I'm hoping to do a panel discussion with Patrick Martone and with Linda Jennings, who's the curator of marine algae for the museum there. And so I think the three of us will have a really good time kind of discussing how this art and science connection is so valuable for bringing the story of the seaweed in general, in that case, and me ongoing with the bull kelp in particular. So that's what we hope will happen. And tentatively, we have February 17th as a date. But that will all be on their website, the BD Biodiversity, BD Museum, at BD Museum. Follow them on Instagram.
You have lots of people to follow on Instagram after this evening. Okay, wonderful. Well, Josie, that was super fantastic and very valuable. I think we all enjoyed your presentation tonight, and thank you for your passion and enthusiasm for kelp and history and all that fun stuff. If you have any last words you want to leave us on, feel free.
Well, I just might say that, doing this, I'm so happy and honored to do this for the Elakha Alliance, and that just the fact that we are able to pop in now, given that we all use Zoom, since the pandemic, we've gotten used to going to conferences all over the place. It really has made happen a lot of what was my impetus when I began this back right when in 2019, when my book came out. I was like, wow, the seaweed people need to go to the otter conferences, and the otter people need to go to the seaweed conferences. And that I got to go to the Salish Sea conference, and I learned all about what's happening up in Puget Sound and the sources of these kelp maps. And so I think that cross-pollination that has been a really kind of lovely byproduct of all of us being on these Zooms is is making some of this cross-pollination already happen, where we're sharing knowledge from different parts of the bull kelp range. So just need to keep going.
Yes, agreed. There is some good to come with being stuck in your house behind a computer, and that's getting to see people from all over the world and connecting. So that's perfect. Okay, well, thank you again for joining us this evening, and be sure to hop on in a couple of weeks on December 16th for our holiday wrap-up party with the Elakha Alliance, and learn all the fun things that we accomplished this year and what we're hopeful for 2022. So have a wonderful evening and happy December. Bye.
Bye. Thanks, Chanel.
You're welcome.